Hi guys, Brett Manning here. I'm trustee of the new Aussie Constitution Trust. If you're new to this channel, the new Aussie Constitution is a proposed draft replacement for the Australian Constitution. It's a draft that's been developed outside of government and outside of political parties. Now, I've been quiet for a while as I've been watching the Parliament review the proposed referendum for indigenous voice to Parliament. As that has gone through the committee process and been reviewed, and I've been watching to see if there is any proposed changes to the wording that we've put to the Australian people, and particularly to the constitutional change itself. Now, as I've explained before, I support indigenous recognition in the Australian Constitution, absolutely. And I'm also prepared to support an indigenous voice to Parliament. And those are the two parts of the question that's being put to voters later in the year. The only problem with that is, the question is one thing, the constitutional amendment that comes with it is something else entirely. Not only do I think that it doesn't deliver on the question that we're being asked, but I also feel it's fundamentally flawed. And that is because we're putting a constitutional amendment in which provides all power to the Parliament to determine every aspect of the indigenous voice to Parliament. So quite apart from the fact that that's absolutely pointless, because the Parliament can do that right now, it also sets the indigenous voice to Parliament up to be forced to change every time there is a change of government for the next 100 years, 200 years. This is a recipe for disaster, and it's inconsistent with the purpose of the Constitution in the first place. The Constitution is to set down those things that the government of the day can't change without the approval of the people. So if we're going to have an indigenous voice to Parliament, then we need to set some limits around that in the same way that we would any other function of government. Without those limits and that guidance, the Parliament and the courts could decide anything about this indigenous voice to Parliament, and that really is a recipe for disaster. But the more concerning thing to me in recent times has been the consultation process around this very important change. So the Prime Minister and the government effectively made a captain's call in announcing both the question and the wording change to the Constitution right up front at the beginning, and has then launched into a purported consultation period, and this review has been conducted by the committees of Parliament, but absolutely no change has occurred to the drafting of the proposal. This is despite the fact that those who oppose the changes raised significant and I think quite reasonable objections to the current wording and to the current proposal. Now, some people will always disagree that this should occur at all. Some people will always agree, regardless of what the wording is. But the reality is that when people pose questions in this important situation of modifying the Constitution, it's reasonable that those questions be answered by the government that is proposing the amendment. And answering the questions is not saying everything will be fine, don't worry about it, there's no issue to see here. There were legitimate concerns raised, and these all stem back ultimately to the fact that there is no guidance in the changes to the Constitution that has been proposed. It simply says that there will be an Indigenous voice to Parliament and it will have the right to consult with government. This amendment doesn't list the powers of the Indigenous voice to Parliament. It doesn't put any limits on what can be discussed or how it can be discussed. It's questionable whether it has the capacity to interfere with the operations of government. These things all need to be answered, and they should have been clearly set out in the constitutional change. Whenever you have a function of government, there should be limits and controls on that function of government that can't be altered by the Parliament of the day. Because now we have a crazy system where if this referendum is passed, the government of the day could choose to make the voice an entire government department. We could find that all legislation had to go past that government department. It could be basically a massive bureaucracy, or the next government come into power might decide that the voice consists of two people chosen by the minister to represent Indigenous views. And it doesn't even have to be two people that are Indigenous. And the fact that this can change back and forward, government after government, disaster is the only word I can think of for this. And it's certainly not how you do constitutional amendments. Now, what about this captain's call? So the Prime Minister said, these are the words we're going to use. Well, there are times when making a captain's call about these things is a good thing. You always talk about a camel being a horse designed by a committee. And there was a danger that with this wording, if extensive consultation was done, it would go round and around and around. And it's certainly been discussed for around the last 10 years. So there are times when a government and a Prime Minister should make a captain's call. But they should admit that that's what they're doing. And they should stand by and defend it on that basis. And they should answer criticisms. And they should listen when there are problems identified, and those problems can be solved by amendments and changes to the proposal. I know this is true because I've been listening to the same debate, and we are working on a revised draft for the new Aussie Constitution at the moment, which will take into account a lot of the negative concerns that people have had around this Indigenous voice to Parliament. So I know improvements can be made and could have been made and are not going to get made the way this process has been run. And it's just not good enough to say, oh, we're consulting, the Parliament has considered it and everything's fine. Because the minority members of that parliamentary committee had significant questions, and those significant questions have gone unanswered. And in taking this approach and not changing anything, despite the criticism, all that has done is to underline the very problem that exists with this change to the Constitution, and that is that everything is left in the hands of the Parliament. And the Parliament is always going to be a partisan group that has control. That's the way we set the system up. It's supposed to be combative. And one side will be the government. And their values and their beliefs will be enacted in laws. But the way that we make sure that one party with all the power doesn't go off the rails in their own direction is by having some limits and some controls in the Constitution. That's what it's there for. And yet here we are proposing an amendment to the Constitution that will put all power for the Indigenous voice in the hands of the Parliament. The Parliament, which will always be a partisan organisation and will change periodically, and every time it changes, the voice will have to change with it, and the legislation around the voice will be amended. Now, if I support the voice and I support the recognition of Indigenous Australians in the Constitution, I don't want this amendment to go through like this. This is not good for Indigenous Australians. This is not good for all the rest of the Australian population. And people say to me, oh, but this is well overdue that the Indigenous peoples be recognised in the Australian Constitution, so you should vote yes anyway. Well, absolutely it's overdue, and I couldn't agree more. But I'm not going to vote yes for a constitutional amendment that will not achieve what it sets out to achieve and is inappropriate, an inappropriate use of the Constitution. So at this stage, unless anything changes, I'm actually going to be voting no for something that I actually support. And what really concerns me is the way the Yes campaign has been pushed and run, and that rather than arguing the advantages of the Yes case, they're trying to shame people. Oh, if you don't vote yes, then you're racist. If you don't vote yes, you're not supporting Indigenous Australians that deserve to be supported. So morally, you're bankrupt. These sort of negative arguments are inappropriate. Just as it's inappropriate when you have High Court justices and other senior legal people saying, look, there could be some problems with this wording. And I accept and recognise that there are very senior legal people who are saying that there are no problems with this proposed drafting. But that's the nature of the High Court system. We won't know until we test it. And you think it's not going to get tested? It absolutely will. And the impact of government until that decision is made could be horrific. And then there'll be other questions, other challenges to what this very, very vague set of constitutional changes actually means, or should mean, going forward. And why will this occur? Because there is not enough clarity, there is not enough detail around the rights and around the responsibilities that go with those rights. And what really worries me is that if this is the present government's approach to just one issue in the Australian Constitution, what's that going to mean if they win another term of government and, as they propose, put forward a referendum for us to become a republic? Will they just roll out their replacement constitution, not allow any changes, and demand that everybody votes for it? The new Aussie Constitution was developed specifically for discussion and consultation. I don't for a minute think that it's the perfect draft. But the intention is to engage people who know their various areas and specialties, for people to consider what should and should not be in the Constitution and how it should operate. And I'm really concerned that what this little exercise has done is demonstrate that the Australian people won't be engaged in a change to the Republic. And the absolute worst outcome will be if they say, oh, here's your question. The question is, do you want to become a republic? And then the constitutional change is, Australia shall be a republic on the terms determined by the Parliament. Because then again, it's like saying which particular footy club won the premiership. All right, you've won the premiership. You can now decide the rules for the next season of the footy game. What a disaster. Anyway, it seems that this legislation will pass through the Senate with support of Labor and Liberals, and it will go to the Australian people, and the Australian people will decide. And whichever way it goes, I think the outcome is going to be disappointing. Thanks for your time.